Imagine a neighbor slowly taking apart your home brick by brick while you're too distracted partying in the front yard to notice. That's essentially what just occurred on the international stage. While the United States was parading tariffs, flaunting global dominance on social media, and congratulating itself for supposedly winning trade wars, Canada was operating behind the curtain, quietly assembling a strategy of immense scale. A strategy so bold and disruptive that it challenges the very notion of what global power looks like. And the way they executed it? Almost no one saw it coming, because this isn't merely a story about steel, aluminum, or even economics. It's about the quiet dismantling of a partnership that held North America together for nearly a century. And what's taking its place could fundamentally alter the future of U.S. influence on the global stage. For those who pay attention to geopolitical currents, the importance of this development cannot be overstated. If you're someone who wants to understand the forces shaping the global order in 2025 and beyond, this is a story that deserves your attention. Canada hasn't just shifted direction. It's issued a quiet but clear warning to the world: a new era of strategic independence is underway. The pivot began on April 2, 2025, a date now etched into the minds of global policymakers. That was the day the U.S., draped in its America First narrative, unveiled what it labeled a strategic tariff correction. But this wasn't just a tweak in trade policy, it was an aggressive economic maneuver. Tariffs on steel were instantly doubled from 25% to 50%. Aluminum was hit. So were electronics, agricultural products, and even semiconductors. The official line from Washington was that these measures were about protecting American workers. But the unspoken message was far more pointed: economic coercion as a tool of loyalty enforcement. What made it even more jarring was the target. This wasn't aimed at a geopolitical adversary. It was directed squarely at Canada, the United States' oldest ally, largest trading partner, and closest diplomatic collaborator for nearly 100 years. While the rhetoric from Washington emphasized trade balance and national security, in Canada and elsewhere it felt more like a betrayal. Canadian companies were blindsided. Supply chains began to tremble under the pressure. And yet many U.S. officials expected Canada to back down, as it had before. They miscalculated badly. While the U.S. media focused on surging job numbers, Ford's $500 million investment, GM's $4 billion retooling, and Hyundai's massive $21 billion expansion, they failed to ask the critical question: why? These weren't signs of confidence in the American market. They were defensive moves, precautionary responses to a partner growing more erratic by the day. And while U.S. headlines shouted success, Canada remained silent. But silence didn't mean stillness. In Ottawa, behind closed doors, a different response was forming, not one of retaliation, but of realignment. Canada wasn't scrambling to push back, it was preparing to walk away entirely. Not with loud protests or threats, but with quiet precision. Its response wasn't a tit-for-tat reaction. It was a full-scale transformation. Just 4 weeks after the U.S. tariffs took effect, Canada made a stunning declaration: it would meet NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending target immediately, 5 years ahead of schedule. Billions in defense investments were set in motion, not into American arms manufacturers, but toward European defense firms. Ottawa launched a series of defense procurements for submarines, Arctic-capable aircraft, naval ships, drone, radar systems, and Arctic surveillance networks. Canadian companies began entering European defense tenders, while Ottawa joined confidential discussions around Europe's rearmament initiative, an endeavor believed to be valued at nearly $900 billion. This wasn't just about spending big. It was a strategic decoupling from decades-old supply chains anchored in the United States. Canadian steel and aluminum that once supported U.S. defense infrastructure were now being redirected toward European naval platforms and Arctic programs. The message was unambiguous: Canada was building its future defense architecture independently, with trusted partners, not ones who weaponized economic policy. The ripple effects were immediate. NATO's European members operating in Canada increased their defense spending by nearly 20% in 2024 alone. But this wasn't just about the numbers, it was a methodical reshaping of the entire defense production landscape, done quietly and with precision. At the same time, Canada turned its attention toward another symbol of dependence: the $19 billion procurement of 88 F-35 fighter jets from the U.S. in March. Ottawa initiated a top-to-bottom review of that deal, citing concerns about over-reliance on the United States for national defense. The review is set to conclude by the end of summer, just in time for the next NATO summit. What's more, Canada is openly exploring alternatives. Options on the table include Sweden's Gripen fighters, participation in a new European fighter aircraft project, or even a domestic production model involving Bombardier, marking a dramatic departure from Boeing and Lockheed Martin's long-standing influence. The logic is sound. By diversifying supply chains, Canada reduces political vulnerability and keeps high-value industrial work at home. And this isn't theoretical. Even Canada's Chief of Defence Staff has acknowledged that while alternative systems may raise costs due to infrastructure and training needs, the long-term benefits in strategic resilience far outweigh them. Canada and Europe are also coordinating closely to develop a more integrated transatlantic defense industrial framework. While the U.S. considers the F-35 program a tool of unity, Canada increasingly views it as a liability, one it's ready to abandon if necessary. This isn't political theater, it's a deep structural shift. At the heart of it, Canada is redirecting tens of billions of dollars away from U.S. firms and toward European partners. This redirection creates new alliances, strengthens domestic industries, and reconfigures the North American defense economy. Ottawa's defense posture is also lending credibility to Europe's broader strategic ambitions. With NATO members considering a 5% GDP defense target by 2035, Canada's early leadership validates that goal and accelerates momentum. The $900 billion European rearmament initiative is gaining ground with a North American country now squarely in its corner. But Canada's pivot doesn't stop with defense procurement. It's emblematic of a wider multipolar shift in global security. It signals that even the most tightly bound U.S. allies are capable and willing to diversify when subjected to economic strong-arming. And that signal is resonating across the globe. Pulling back for a wider view, this isn't just about trade disputes or fighter jets. It's the systematic dismantling of a strategic dependency that had shaped Canada's foreign trade and security policy for nearly a century. For decades, the U.S. wasn't just Canada's largest trading partner, it was its default partner. But after years of rising tariffs, unpredictable policy shifts, and protectionist pressures, Canada reached a clear conclusion: relying on the United States is no longer a safe strategy. This decision wasn't born out of nationalism or ideology. It was born from necessity. Canada isn't chasing headlines, it's building a resilient future. In a world where a single political outburst or social media post can trigger billions in losses or upend trade overnight, having options is no longer a luxury, it's a survival mechanism. And here's the critical point. The United States failed to understand the cost of its own approach. Rather than fortify long-standing alliances, it tested them to their limits. Tariffs, technology sanctions, and supply chain restrictions were all designed to project strength, but they ended up weakening trust. Canada's response reveals a fundamental truth. In today's multipolar world, even mid-sized nations can assert control over their destiny. They can create new partnerships, design parallel economic systems, and escape long-standing dependency traps. And Canada has done all of this not with grand declarations, but with calm strategy and quiet determination. No finger-pointing, no diplomatic outbursts, just smart, deliberate execution. In real time, Canada has redrawn the strategic map of North America. The world took notice and responded. Across Europe, especially in capitals like Berlin and Paris, Canada's pivot is seen as evidence that democratic nations can successfully reduce reliance on U.S.-centric systems without compromising on growth or security. By mid-2025, multiple European countries were already fast-tracking defense procurement deals with Canadian firms. Simultaneously, intelligence sharing programs expanded to include Asia-Pacific allies like Japan and South Korea. These longtime U.S. partners quietly opened diplomatic backchannels with Ottawa, exploring joint defense R&D, trade corridors, and regional cooperation. Even Australia signaled interest in joining new trans-Pacific defense initiatives that now feature Canada as a co-founder and strategic leader. Inside North America, the ripple effects are growing. Mexico, historically cautious about upsetting the U.S. economic order, has begun looking at expanding its EU trade footprint using Canada's blueprint. It's no longer inconceivable that U.S. neighbors could construct geopolitical strategies that don't revolve entirely around Washington. Where the United States once acted as the gravitational center of Allied decision-making, it is now one star among many in a broadening constellation of global actors. The U.S. still holds unmatched military power. But its soft power, its ability to lead through trust, cooperation, and moral authority is visibly eroding. What Canada is offering the world is not just a model of survival. It's a model of vision. It demonstrates what becomes possible when a country stops asking for better treatment and starts designing better options. This wasn't a tariff dispute. It was a defining geopolitical moment. Canada didn't retaliate, it restructured. And that restructuring turned weakness into strength. While Washington played checkers, reactive and short-term, Canada played chess. It gave up nothing. It maintained composure, adjusted its pieces, and reset the entire board. And the most extraordinary part? It did all of this without raising its voice. No media stunts, no angry summits, just careful policy, steady hands, and a consistent message behind closed doors. We have alternatives now. The results speak for themselves. Europe is aligning with Canada. Asia is exploring new partnerships. Allies once centered on the U.S. are realizing that loyalty doesn't require submission, it requires mutual respect. So while Washington may still think it leads the world, the map is already shifting silently, deliberately, and permanently. Not out of rebellion, not out of fear, but out of strategic foresight. What Canada just pulled off will be studied for generations. Not as a reaction, but as a redefinition. Not as rebellion, but as evolution. The age of dependence is ending. And the next era? It's already being written by quiet, steady hands in Ottawa.